in a different place. I like to come and sit in the room and work on the PowerPoint that I'm going to work on. And so yesterday I came in here and I was working on my PowerPoint and thinking about the different things that I was going to talk about. And strangely, I came back to what was unquestionably one of the best weekends of my life. This was in 1995. Yes, I'm that old. Because on the weekend of the 8th and 11th of June, 1995, two great things happened in my life. One of them was I got married on the 11th, on the weekend of the 11th. And that's my wife, Meredith Chesson, who's also an archaeologist. And thinking about that weekend and thinking about her and thinking about this room takes us to the second reason why the 8th of June was so important for me. I graduated with my PhD. And this gentleman was the commencement speaker. He was the individual who came and spoke at Harvard during the commencement. And to be frank, I didn't know an awful lot about him at that time. But of course, I was deeply impressed as a thinker, as a speaker, and somebody who came and held forth about so many very important things. And much to my surprise, using the wireless system that is here, I decided to go back and read his entire commencement speech. I hadn't read it ever before. I'd listened to it 30 years ago this summer, but I'd never read it. And it was at that point that I went through and read it, and I was really struck by many of his statements, and in some ways the anticipation of many different things. But also when you start looking at the words such as this, of thinking about the weak, the infirm, the need for taking care of them, the fact that civilization is a multicultural and multipolar civilization, the kind of thoughts that for so many years have stitched together the world that we've lived in and thought about, I was also very saddened because, of course, one has to wonder what his thoughts and reflections would be in the kind of world we live in today. I took some optimism out of that, and some of it was partially because of the people he intersected with in so many different ways. I found myself not only reading his words, but looking at photographs and going through, including, here he is with Barack Obama. Here he is with Madeleine Albright and Robert Redford, who passed away a couple days ago. And the stitching together of not only intellectuals, but people who thought about worlds in different ways. I want to use that as a segue then, and to think in terms of questions that I've been wrestling with and things that I've been trying to think about. And one of them is really thinking about some of our ecological models and our models related to population pressure, basically the forces that are traditionally viewed as pulling people apart and causing change, both something that's progressive and positive, but also something that is, in the long term, something that's very detrimental to some groups. The idea, of course, being behind it, being that population pressure is something that lies behind social differentiation, the haves and the have-nots. And what I want to do is I want to sort of think about some of these different dimensions here, and thinking about, in some ways, rather than thinking about a progressive narrative of improvement and development, which is sort of the layering that we often hold to when we think about the longue durée of the human past. And I want to think of the Neolithic as something that's probably a little more nuanced and something that is more along the lines of 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps backward, and also really thinking in terms of how well or how poorly we're thinking in terms of population and thinking in terms of, as prehistorians and as researchers working, how we're in some ways failing our mission to try and think about people in terms of scale. Now, this, of course, is linked back to all kinds of different conversations, including Malthus with his principles of population, which is one of the first explorations of that from the standpoint of looking at people, looking at other populations, Also thinking about things such as carrying capacity as an idea, to think in terms of how animals are sort of accessing resources and balancing those in terms of survivorship in the long term. But then also thinking about it on other levels, such as that of when do we have basically explosions of population, the Neolithic traditionally being identified as one of the major ones. And then the argument that I'm going to be sort of going through with my good colleague, Eric Marciniak, some research that we worked on for many years and finally published last year, is trying to think in terms of really how much do we know about how many people lived in foundational villages. And so I want to think about that and in a way that's hopefully transportable so that different people can think about that. This is the root of it, and that is the kind of work that's come forth by people like Jean-Pierre Bacapelle or other individuals, is really thinking about the Neolithic from a demography standpoint, the Neolithic as being this explosive growth in population. And that's been articulated in a lot of his different works by other people as well. And hidden behind that is the sense of looking at Neolithic sites in different places, the sense of population explosion, and somehow this connection that this represents near urbanism, that there's some sort of hints of urbanism that are taking root in these earlier points. And these are tightly connected together. They're usually not explicitly presented, but they really are integrated. And in a way that is, in some ways, I think very, very dangerous for what we're doing and what we're trying to understand. I would argue that when we think of foundational villages, and here I'm going to make the argument that this is not limited to the Neolithic. You could just as easily argue this for the Iron Age of Eastern Europe. You can make the argument for Pueblo Bonito in the American Southwest. You could just as easily roll it on to the 5th to the 9th century of Ireland or here in the medieval period. The foundations are largely the same when we start thinking about the common characteristics. Things such as that there's some degree of sedentism, people living in the same areas, the ability to store food in some capacity, that there's a high resource diversity that allows for buffering, shall we say. There's clearly a processing and harvesting technology. There's good potential domesticates. And probably the last one is that there's a high population density. And hidden behind this in the arguments is usually one of that somehow there's been this period of exponential growth. Now, that's where it gets complicated, because as researchers, we have almost no understanding of essentially in those cases where we have aggregation of people into places. We have a temporal narrative of people living in an area. And then at a later point, we have bigger villages or hamlets, whatever term we want to use. And the narrative is one of population goes up in some form. The problem is we don't really understand, and we don't have the methods at this point to think in terms of what is actual population growth in a site versus something that's regional. We don't really have a way of pulling that apart, and we sort of avoided that in different ways. So in the context of the Neolithic, it basically comes down to these kinds of visual narratives. That's one of people living together in a very tight, common way. As I mentioned to you, I don't think it really makes a difference where we talk about this as a phenomenon. There is now a point where we are having re-engagements with arguments, such as at Cahokia, which is the largest prehistoric site in the United States, in the middle of the United States, one under which it is a very large site with, it's about 5 miles. Sorry, I should have changed that into kilometers. Let's call it 8K. and that we have various buildings associated with it, a series of different mounds. And that's where conversations go in different directions in terms of how many people live there. On some levels, you have people arguing, and these are good researchers, arguing that there's as many as 30,000 people that were living here, with in the neighborhood of 50,000 people in outskirts areas. Then you have other researchers, such as George Milner, who estimates that this is in the low thousands. So there's a huge diversity in this particular case and disagreement between good researchers. You have the same arguments that are taking place in terms of the American Southwest. Think of Chaco Canyon or that kind of a context. You can think about it in an area that's even closer. Think of central Ukraine and think of the Tripolian the sites and sort of disagreements and arguments as to how many people lived in these. Now, the argument's not the number of buildings, and the argument's not the ditches or village layout. It's fundamentally coming down to the question of how many of these structures were contemporaneous and how long were they lived in for. And then by extension, the number of people who would have lived in each of those buildings. That's where the disagreements lie. And on the basis of that, you have a huge range of different estimates. And if you ask how many people live there, that depends who you talk to. And if you're talking to them in the middle of the day, or you're talking to them after they've had 2 beers and they're at the pub and they're now a little looser and having some conversation. And so the estimates go as high from what I've found, 46,000. I'm sure there's others that are even higher. Chapman et al. Talk about the literature as a range of 7,000 to 46,000. Mueller et al. Argue for about 15,000. But then at different points, their arguments are one that are softer around the edges. And this is part of what we do as archaeologists. This demography and population is a very difficult thing to work with. It's one, I would argue, we've kind of avoided. And there's good reasons for it, to avoid it. But I'd also argue that avoiding it is not helping us in the long term. So that's where I want to go, is to think about some of these. And to do this, I want to think about the Neolithic of the Near East. And I want to look at a series of different sites and to look at these and really thinking about that question of how many houses are contemporaneous, how many, what spacing existed between them, how long they were lived in, and how many people lived in them. And using the kind of work that Eric and I have done over the last 15 years or so, really trying to reassess this in a way that is quantifiable, that we feel more comfortable with. And that's where I want to sort of take things. Now, buried in this, of course, is just as I was talking about, and Camilla's statement here, which is a very good one, and that is recognizing that we have these mega sites. The use of that as a term, I think, is unfortunate in literature, but we're sort of stuck with it. The scaling up, and that somehow this is something that is almost urban in some form. It's a very tempting argument, both in terms of the physical layout, but the other pieces to it. But it's one that I'm not entirely comfortable with, and I'm going to sort of go through. The root of it is quite simple, and that is, as archaeologists, when we go to see either the site in the upper right, which is Basta in Jordan, Esfaya down below, the one in the background is the Çatalhöyük in Turkey. When you see those, you cannot help but be impressed. You look at the buildings, you look at the density, and you just look at it and go, this is big, this is impressive. And so it's understandable that we are impressed by this in some form. But I don't think we've really thought critically about this in how to sort of look at this. The narrative, of course, is now that if you want to think about a poster child, or a poster site, I should really say, Çatalhöyük is the big one. Since the 1960s, this has existed as sort of the landmark site people have looked at and said, this is the example of near urbanism. This is the example under which population explosion took place. The narration of Çatalhöyük, the world's oldest town. When the world's population took off, the springboard of the Neolithic demographic transition. Near urban living, Çatalhöyük and the late Neolithic megasites. These are the narratives that are now entering into the literature, have entered into the literature, that are sort of combining these different threads, the archaeology, and now putting it into a package that is progressive of sort of this, not an evolutionary climax, but in some ways one under which we have this combination of people, some form of social debate in terms of inequality, and then that of population behind all of this. Here's the tricky part to it, and that is when you start thinking about the different pieces involved here, and that is all research has a historical start. And in this particular point, I want you to look very closely here at what's being listed. What I've listed here is looking at population estimates that were originally provided. And it might be hard for some of you to see, but going back to 1965 with Mellart, he made the argument in one of his first big publications of between 8,000 and 10,000 people living in Çatalhöyük. This was then sort of continued to be expressed by Cohen as 6,000 plus, Ian Todd by 5 to 10,000. Mellart in 1979 comes back to it and says it's 5 to 7,000. Roger Matthews goes with 5 to 6,500, shall we say. Cessford and Hodder go from 3,500 to 8,000. Then this one in 2019, Hodder goes with 3,500 to 8,000 people. This in a publication with Joanna Plug et al. Scales it down to about 2,800. In November of 2021, after this one, he's now throwing out the number of 8,000 people. So there's a couple different things here. One is that the population estimates that we share publicly are kind of influenced by which audience we're talking to. In a public audience, Hodder and others are talking about 5 to 8,000. In a group of more critical archaeologists, the numbers are more likely to be 2,500 to 3,000 people. So the audience depends, there's a big influence in terms of the audience. The other part to it is that we have to think about this in terms of academic kinship. And how do these numbers get transported? The argument that I would make, and I should tell you right now, I've had this kind of conversation with multiple researchers, including Ian Hodder. So this is what I'm talking to you about today is not some kind of dirty bad-mouthing in any form. These are conversations that Ian and I have had at different points. One of the things that is interesting about it is the relationship between some of these key individuals. And that is, James Mellart was highly influenced by V. Gordon Childe. And V. Gordon Childe, of course, was the grand synthesizer in terms of the Neolithic, the urban revolution, all these different pieces. And in some ways laid out, starting in the 30s onwards, his foundational assumptions of that there are these villages. There is that urban experiment that's out there. And it's understandable that when James Mellart went and started to do his research, as he was teaching at UCL, when he started to do his research, when he looked at Çatalhöyük and these other sites, it's entirely understandable that he looked at the scale of the site. He thought in terms of Childe in some capacity. And I think there was that long shadow of V. Gordon Childe that was cast over the site, one under which it made sense to him that there must have been a lot of people living there. What was Mellart's original number based on? Nothing more than taking a piece of paper, pulling it out of the back pocket, looking around saying, how many people lived here? And they're going, 8 to 10,000. There was no systematic research saying, let's calculate the physical area, Let's calculate the number of burials, the number of buildings. There was nothing done in any form. His estimate, and to be honest, I probably would have done the same thing if I was alive at that point of time. His estimate was brought out of the air. And that estimate, I would argue, essentially preconditioned all of the other population estimates that followed. And so there is this, to use the frame of the great chain of being, there is this passing on of knowledge, and that these conversations go back to the original estimate. And I would argue that in some ways, this conversation that Ian Hodder and some of his other researchers have had over the years is in some ways echoing what V. Gordon Childe laid forth as expectations, but also one of what Mellert originally put forth as numbers. Now, I can back that up a little further and take it there. This illustration, to be honest, I think this illustration has done more harm to the Neolithic of the Near East than any other single one. It's a beautiful illustration. It is replicated everywhere in any kind of publication. This is figure number 12 from 1967. And it became the visual crystallization of what a Neolithic site in the Near East would look like. And that is that you would have all these standing buildings that are nice and tight and slapped together in this gorgeous way, in such a way where it was essentially row housing, residential row housing, such you see up here outside of Wimbledon in England. One under which you have these standing buildings all the way across. And from that, with no understanding of building use life, or how many people might have lived in there, or any counts of the number of buildings, that became the 8,000 to 10,000 estimate. And this became the visualization of those numbers. And that, in some ways, I would argue, has continued to perpetuate this sense of these as some near-urban experiment in some form. So how many people actually lived in these places? How can we think about it in a more critical way to try and pull apart some of these different pieces? How do we do this? Whether we're talking about an early medieval village in Czech, whether we're talking about Tripolian site, American Southwest. How do we do that? How can we wrestle with that? What I want to do is sort of show you how Eric and I have tried to explore this in a Neolithic context, and sort of where those results sit. I've done a lot of work in population modeling over the years, and some of it I'm not particularly proud of. In many ways, I really regret, in 2000, when I was a young puppy, 5 years out of my dissertation, I wrote a big piece for the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology, where I went and ran through estimates. And these are shown here in red, in terms of the number of people. And this was very much following the narrative of Mellert and others, thinking about it in a transplanted context to the southern Levant. Later on in 2008, I thought about it further in terms of ethnographic information. I rescaled it, I went back and thought about it, and published these numbers that you see here. This was then published by Birch Chapman. This is their chart from Birch Chapman et al. 2014. This is 1,000 to give you an example. This is 3,500 to sort of give you a sense. I really regret having published that, because now I look at it and I go, not only do I disagree with what I said, but unfortunately, these numbers are now used to support the arguments of the big village of 3,500 to 8,000 people. So it's a real problem. It's also interesting that when you start looking at other people's attempts in terms of very important demographers, McVendley and Jones, Atlas of World Prehistory, they had a wonderful statement in their attempt to deal with global population numbers. This is in the 1970s. And they say, we haven't just pulled figures out of the sky. Well, not often. they understand what's going on. They understood, I should say, what's going on. What we as a group of researchers have yet to realize is that in some ways we're doing this, we historically did the same thing. And it's now time for us to think about it in a different way. Now, there's one exception, an excellent piece of research that came out of the Çatal project under Craig Sesford's guidance. And he went in 2001, Craig Sesford went back and he basically said, how do we operationalize this? How do we go and understand Neolithic population? How can we do that in a way that is quantifiable? It's not just coming out of the back pocket in some form. And so what he did, based on research by George Ammerman, and this formula, by the way, and all this information is in the publication that we had that came out last summer. And I'd be very happy to send it to you if you'd like it. Basically, he went and used Ammerman's system and with a series of assumptions, used a formula where you could punch in a series of assumptions into that, and it will then put out an estimate of the number of people that used to live in the site. The critical assumptions, because we all know that our modeling in some form depends on the assumptions we're willing to use and the compromises we're willing to make. The critical parts to this, in terms of how he ended up operationalizing this, is that he estimated that 20% of the mound was unoccupied. So the whole physical area, he estimated that 80% of it had buildings on it at any one point of time. He also argued that only 10 to 20% of the buildings were unoccupied. And the last piece was that these structures were used between 45 and 90 years, that was the use life of these structures. So on the basis of that, it punches out a number of 3,500 to about 8,000 people. And I'll show you in a little later on how that works, just so that you can see that. It's an explicit model. And by the way, I've gone back with Craig Sesford. Eric and myself went back to Craig Sesford and said, hey, Craig, look, we're revisiting the numbers. We wanted to get your take on this. And he wrote me back in a really nice way saying, thanks for contacting me about this. And he said something to the effect, and Craig, I hope I'm quoting you correctly here, it was something to the level of, I have to tell you, I'm really surprised that it's taken this long for anybody to question those numbers. He essentially was saying, I never thought those numbers were really going to stay in the literature on this level. We had a very good going back and forth. So here's the critical questions. And this is relevant to, I would argue, just about any archaeology site you want to deal with when you want to think about how do we reconstruct demography. We have to ask the question about village biography. How many buildings were occupied at the same point of time? We have to ask how many years were different buildings used for? And the critical thing there is buildings, we know from ethnographic contexts, think of Iran and mud brick villages in rural areas that Carol Kramer and Patty Jo Watson documented in the 70s. We know standing buildings do not equal residential buildings because you can have a residential building that is then repurposed for storing grain, storing farming equipment. The kids could grow up and they move away to a different village or something else happens. So it's a critical question. And then the next part, of course, is how many people actually lived in the building? So those are the critical assumptions. And so when we look at this kind of screen that you see from a Çatalhöyük, we have to ask ourselves some of those questions, and we have to wrestle those in some capacity. Here's one of the other parts for Mellart's original understanding, and that Mellart recognized through his excavations that many of these buildings had many, many layers of plaster on the inside. On the inside of them, they've been plastered, white plaster, sometimes with color and decoration. They've been plastered multiple times. He looked at that and he said, this is annual plastering. People are painting the inside of the house once a year. And so his idea was simply that of, let's count up the number of plastering events, and that will tell us how long the building's been lived in. Simple, and in some ways a very astute assumption. This was then transported in terms of Wendy Matthews, whose excellent research. She documented that in some of the buildings, there was 160 layers of plaster. And that would very much seem to have supported the arguments for these buildings being used for a long period of time. Now, the challenge in there, of course, is we don't know how often people paint the inside of their house in the Neolithic. The assumptions once a year seems reasonable. Could it be more times? Could it be less? Could it ever be 2 years? There's some real challenges here. Here's one of the other pieces to it, and that is one piece of research that Wendy put forth was, and this is from her later period work, if I recall correctly, looking at one building. This is building 5. And what you see is that in one room, the main room, which is the living room, that's been plastered 450 times. Thin plaster layers all the way across. The storage room, which is right next door, and this, by the way, you could probably fit, I would bet, easily 3 of these buildings in this room. I'm not entirely sure, but you might even be able to get 4 of them in here, to be honest. Anyways, the storage room has only 3 or 4 plaster layers, and yet it's the same building. So how are we going to reconcile those? Is this keeping the kitchen clean and keeping it nice and bright with white plaster? We don't know, but it by definition, we have to start rethinking the assumption that individual plaster layers equal once a year. And I'm pretty sure that Wendy would agree with me on this one at this point. What do we learn in terms of building use life? Well, we of course have different sources, both archaeological, but also that of ethnographic, and in terms of geoarchaeological in different ways. And what we now know is that with geoarchaeological research is that some excellent work that's been done by David Frism and company in multiple places is that these buildings are used somewhere between 15 and 30 years, even with maintenance of some form. So using oral history, using documentation, and using sedimentological research, they're basically demonstrating 15 to 30 years. So that's giving us one piece of information. We can also see this in terms of archaeology. Tel Sabiabiad, Johanna Plug, and others argued that houses typically were used for about a single generation. It's hard from a demographic standpoint to understand exactly what a generation is, 30 to 40 years, depending on how you model it. Now, the other piece of to keep in mind here, though, is this is some work that Eric published in 2014 in Antiquity. And based on Bayesian analysis, what they find is that a lot of buildings on spaces are used for 15 years or less, others less than 30, 10 to 45. There's a huge range, many of these being quite low. So it means there's variability between buildings, which is also something that we have to start considering as we start sort of having to sort of figure out what kind of analysis. Either way, when you translate this, most of these relate to single generations. In some cases, it can be longer in some form. Here's another way to think about it. This is based on some research that I'm doing with people from Kuijt, and that is looking at sedimentation rates and looking at with Bayesian analysis of radiocarbon information. In this particular case, using the deep trench section that they have there. And in the process, what we've done is we've done Bayesian analysis of basically midden deposits below buildings. What you see with the red lines are a series of Neolithic buildings up above. And what we find is that the deposits that are taking place here, this is 8 buildings used for over 135 years. So inside of these are deposits about 3.3 centimeters per year. Midden deposits, same kind of thing going on, 2.3 centimeters. That entire sequence, 7.6 meters worth, that entire sequence, based on Bayesian analysis, probably was deposited in about 270 years. That's a lot of material. And asking ourselves, well, how does all that sediment get there? Why does that sediment get there in some form? And by the way, this echoes not only Çatalhöyük with what's taking place, but even from Jericho. In Jericho, it's the same thing here. 8 buildings over 150 years, 4 meters of deposits. It works out to 2.6 centimeters of deposit. So there's a lot of material that's deposited, sediments that are being deposited on these sites. And we have to think further about why is that taking place? Here's the argument I'm going to make. I think it's related to water management and erosion of basically unfired brick buildings. I think what's taking place is that with these buildings being maintained, people trying to maintain these, that you have, when you understand how they're built, they're built in such a way where they're flat on the ground, they have posts, they have posts that come up, you have a combination of wood, reed, and sticks on the roof, then you have mud on the roof, you have mud on the walls, and what occurs is, of course, is that with the winter rains, water will move sediment off these buildings. So in many ways, we have to think about Neolithic buildings as umbrellas. We have to think about them in the context of water management, and that probably it's working in such a way where there's a good bit of water that's causing a good bit of erosion. Here's the other piece that we've been doing in our research, thinking about it in terms of Çatalhöyük. And this, we've yet to publish this, but we're very close to it at this point. This is a series of reconstructed buildings that Miraban and Güneş built in 2010. You can see the lovely walls. You can see the floors nearby, outside and inside. You can see the reeds on the top. These are fresh, and this is the way they look when they're first made. Also, notice that's the vision of Figure 12 from 1967. That is essentially those nice, clean, standing buildings that you have, these fresh buildings that are all that wet. This is from 2014. You can't quite see it here, but this is all sediment that's come off. This is one that they deliberately left to see what erosion takes place. These are 2 buildings that they have as part of this. This is from 2024. This is 14 years. Some of this has been maintained. You can see the erosion at the base. You can see the piling of sediment along the edges of it and the fact that it tapers off. This shouldn't surprise us. This is exactly what we would expect. It may be faster than we expect, but this is not rocket science. So one of the things that we did was we went back to the experimental buildings that were constructed in 2010, and we've done excavations now to look to see what kind of deposits are taking place, how quickly the deposits are taking place. And lo and behold, it fits very well with this Neolithic modeling. This modeling in terms of the different pieces. So what does 2.5 centimeters look like? So it doesn't sound like very much, but if you look at this illustration that we put together here, what does it look like over 1 year? That's the upper left. What does it look like over 10 years on the upper right? What does it look like 20 years? And what does it look like after 40 years? What you find, and keeping in mind that these are buildings that are often very tight together, it means you've got a lot of deposits that are going between the buildings. Not only is that wet and mucky and that you wish you had rubber rain boots in the Neolithic to walk around in, but it also means that water has to go somewhere. and water tends to go down. It doesn't go up. So as it comes off of a roof, such as up there, comes into these places and redeposits, it's going to be going at some point to the inside of buildings. And I would just assume that at some point, there was not only an aesthetic reason, but basically the reason if you want to control humidity levels and you're storing grain inside of your house, at some point you say, Mom, Dad, this isn't working. This is not working very well for us. Let's build a new building. And you fill it in and you build a new one on top of that. So I think there's good reason to believe that there are functional and engineering aspects to this that we really haven't wrestled with in some form. The other part to think about, how closely packed together are some of the buildings? If the standard model is dense row housing, such as you see in the upper left in this illustration, or Jonathan Swaggart's illustration here, if that's the standard model, there's also members of the Çatal project who are starting to think about this in a different way. Mike Charles and Amy Bogart being two of the individuals, let alone Eric Marciniak and others, who are now thinking about it's not a carpet of buildings all the way across the Çatal, it's clusters of buildings that are loosely defined with spaces in between. That's very different. So it's not a matter of row housing with continuous buildings in some form, but there's spaces in between. That's a harder thing to demonstrate, but I think we're making progress on that in some form. That model fits very well with what we know from an ethnographic standpoint. When we think in terms of ethnography, and here I'm going to draw on two works, one of Carol Kramer and one by Patty Jo Watson. Carol Kramer's work in Iran looked at a particular village and looked at sort of mapping the whole thing, looked at where people lived, how many people in the village in different buildings. It's a brilliant piece of work, underutilized by researchers as far as I'm concerned. This is the other one. This is Patty Jo Watson's work, where she worked in a different village, one under which there was a known population. She did extraordinary stuff in terms of basically census level data related to the buildings. How many people lived in them, what their ages were, what their names were, male, female, the relationships between them. You can even start pulling it apart in terms of marriage if you want to. It's fantastic. So just to show you, this section here is roughly the section you're looking at, okay? So lots of villages out, lots of area of the village outside of that, but this is the section right here that you're looking at. The colored in rooms that you see there, the buildings that are colored in, are the ones where people live. The other ones are still standing, but nobody is living in them. They're being used for storing food, for storing farming equipment, to get rid of the kids on a day where you just can't handle them anymore and it's raining outside. You say, go play, kids, kick them out of the house, go play in such and such a house. And you get rid of them out there. It becomes the playpen in some form. So right off, you can see maybe 50% of the standing buildings are being used residentially. Here's the other part to it, though. If you start looking at where people lived, the different colors show you the different biological families. So, for example, this family and this family are connected, even though they're not living right next to each other. The other part to it is if you can look, here's one adult, age 27, a male, living in here. Here, there's a total of 5 people living here. 2 of them are children. We know their ages. We can sort of trace this. And what you end up seeing is that all this maximal analysis that we do in terms of there's an average of 5 or 6 people. You know, there's various researchers who will say 5 or 6 people lived in each house. And therefore, you count up the number of houses. You say X number of them are contemporary. There's 5 of them, and that gives you the number. What this is showing us is the actual occupancy rate for this entire village is maybe 1 person per standing building. That's what it comes down to. And that's a shocker because that changes how we run our population estimates. So the big picture, thinking about those assumptions now and sort of pulling that apart. First of all, based on all these different pieces, these threads I'm throwing out to you, buildings are probably used, I'm going to call it 15 to 25 years. Eric thinks probably a little bit more than that. Joanna Plug, et cetera, 15 to 35. But clearly, it's very different from the 45 to 90 years that Hodder has argued, Sesford argued, or the 80 to 140 years that Hodder has argued in different places. The other parts to it is that, if that's sort of the information we have now, what happens if we go back to Sesford's formula and we put in these new numbers? And this is where sort of the dirty trick of this publication came through. And that is, what we did was we went through and used his system and put in the different numbers to the different assumptions, estimates for different assumptions, and see where it takes us. So here's the original work. So here's a calculation, and I'm not going to walk through it. You're welcome to go back and look at the publication and the supplemental information for it. But the bottom line is that this is looking at 20% of the site being unoccupied, one of the foundational assumptions of Sesford. It's looking at 45 to 90 years, and it produces a number of about 7,000 people. So this is sort of in the ballpark. This is producing the numbers that Sesford and Hodder have used over the years. And that sort of follows on from the Mellart standpoint. And again, that's sort of the visualization of what that would have looked like. This is what happens with the numbers if you argue that it's 15 to 30 years. If you put those numbers in and you're looking at 4 people per building, it's producing very low numbers, 330 to 1,200 people. That's very different. Now, to make it a little more complicated, what we also did was we looked at it in terms of different scenarios, basically scenarios of low occupancy, medium occupancy, high occupancy, and looked at it from the standpoint if 60% of the mound was covered by buildings versus 40%. So this is essentially a way of allowing researchers to say, okay, I believe that 60% of the mound is covered, or I believe 40% is. And then seeing what those scenarios tell you. But basically, the trick is it's forcing people to identify their assumptions. It's no longer pulling out a napkin and saying, here's the real number. It's getting people to really put down what their assumptions are and then see where it takes them on the highway. So in this scenario, the numbers get even less in some form. One of the other things that we wanted to do is we know that there's variability. And we know that there's variability in terms of some buildings are used for a longer period of time than other ones. So what we did is we started to think about what are 3 different scenarios. And so we put together scenario 1, 2, 3 for looking at average building use life. So for example, in the top scenario here, if you look at the categories of buildings used for 20 years, 30 years, 45, 90, 120. And those numbers we did just pull out of the back of our pants. But that's just for the analysis of comparison. And here, if you look, we've worked under scenario 1 that 30 out of 100 buildings, 30 of them were used for 20 years. 40 were used for 30 years. 25 were used for 45 years. 5 were used for 90 years, and 0 were used for 120. So that's one scenario. And it works out to 27.75 years per building. All right? You can do this with other scenarios. So for example, here, we ran a scenario where 15 of these were used for 120 years, and only 5 of them were used for 5 years. And on the basis of that, you can develop different estimates for the number of years, the total number of years that they were used for. The point here is we're not arguing that some buildings were not used for 90 years. We think that less that there's less of them, much less of them, than the 20 to 30 year scenario. So we're sort of, that's the way we tried to do it in such a way to understand how it all fits together. This is what we ended up with as sort of as a visual means to try and understand this. What you can see here, this is thousands of people on this side. This is average building use life in years, 10, 20, 30, 45, and 90. And this is 80% of the mound covered, 60% of the mound, 40%, and 20% of the mound covered. So depending on the assumptions that you end up with very different levels. This is where we feel our comfort level is, somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 to 800 people at Çatal in the classic period. That's very different than the other estimates that are up above. I think it's safe to say that this has not been particularly warmly endorsed by certain people. Some people have said that number is way too low. The kind of position that Eric and I are taking is really one of, then show us how you're going to do it. Show us how you're going to make those similar calculations in an explicit way that can be replicated in some form. And if you don't like these assumptions that we're using in terms of coverage, then use some ethnographic information or archaeological information to make a case in a different direction. But this provides, hopefully, a means under which we can have conversations about population and what that means. Let's scale it back up. Thinking about if that's sort of what we've learned from Çatal, the argument being maybe it's 600 to 800 people rather than 3,500 to 5,000 or 8,000. Why does it make a difference? Well, interestingly enough, we're not the only ones that are wrestling with this. The Tertullian work, there's been some really interesting debate that's gone on in terms of population with these Tertullian sites in some form. This is some really interesting work that Hoffman et al. Did. And this is looking at group size on the bottom, and this is looking at floor size. And what they've done is that they use a different way of generating estimates. Basically, ethnographic information, again, low-scale ethnographic and high-scale, what they call here. So you can see low-level ethnography, ethnographic information. This is between 10 and 100 people. Then they're looking at high-level ethnographic in here, which is between 100 and 1,000. And then they're looking at high-level ones over here, which I've sort of added these urbanism and sort of these kinds of terms in here, going up to 10,000 people. The point to get out of this from my standpoint is look at where these ethnographic numbers are. Anything that is using ethnography to try and understand the modeling in some form is producing us numbers that are under 1,000, and maybe it's 600 to 800 people in that zone in some form. So they've kind of come back to this in a different way and kind of having the same conversations about what is contemporary in terms of buildings, how long were buildings used for, and sort of rethinking some of those different pieces. What does it look like when we start thinking about it in terms of something more regional? So here's one illustration. This is coming back to my Near Eastern work, thinking in terms of particular sites in different locations. So the original illustration, the red one that you see here, are the population estimates based on physical size. Population or physical area of the square that I ran in 2000. Amazingly 25 years ago now. The green ones are the more recent ones, looking at those numbers. And that changes things enormously. Not only individual sites, but the relationship between communities as well. Because this is a challenge. We're not just talking about insulated sites. We're talking about regional resources. We're talking about resources the next valley over. And so we have to start thinking about population, not just individual sites. We kind of if we're going to have conversations about population pressure, demographic pressure, carrying capacity, we have to think in a bigger regional scale. Why does it matter? I kind of take it as self-evident that it does, but I think it's important to identify really why it matters. So some of the different pieces here is that whether we're coming back to Malthus or whether we're talking about other little pieces here, if population is being used as an environmental driver in some form, then we need to ask the question, how many people lived in a village? We have to wrestle with that. We have to ask ourselves other simple questions such as, how much food is necessary to feed a village? How much food is necessary on a yearly basis to feed a household, a village? And does that fit with our sense of archaeological storage? We have to ask those kinds of questions. We also have to ask the question, if we're talking about social networks that existed, not between villages, but within villages, because villages are all cooperating and competing entities with different households, then we have to think in terms of scale. Because if you're talking about 5,000 people versus 500, that's very, very different. And I'll show that to you in just a second. Here's the other part to it. And this comes back to something we were talking about at an earlier point. There's a lot of paleoecologists and sort of economic anthropologists who do paleoeconomy. And they love Peter Turchin, others. They love taking the kind of archaeological data we develop for our population numbers. And they love putting them into their formula and bang, out comes something that helps them understand a bigger picture in some capacity. And this is one really, really good piece of research here with an explicit formula looking at these different pieces. This is the big science moment in some form. But think for a second. Here's the big science piece to it where you have questions such as food requirements, labor availability, baseline caloric requirements. We can get that. We can get that kind of information. Look at what sits in the center here as a giant roadblock. Population, age, structure, total size. That's the critical moment. That's where these paleoeconomics researchers are going to the archaeologists knocking on their door and say, hey, how many people lived at Çatalhöyük? And then away goes the numbers and away goes the research. They're going to get very different results if you're punching in 600 to 800 people versus 3,500 to 5,000 people. So we're not being good stewards by not really engaging in these questions. We're not being good stewards of the information. In some ways, we're creating problems for ourselves in the future because now we're going to be in a situation we're going to have to explain backwards what's going on. Carrying capacity is another aspect to this. And, carrying capacity is an ecological framing of what are local resources that are available. It's based on, mammalian research, one of population through time and resources that are available. This has been applied casually in different contexts. Vita Fitz and others, Higgs, in Mount Carmel were one of the few groups. There's been others that have tried to engage with this, looking at population growth, carrying capacity, and conflict. But for the most part, as a group of scholars, archaeologists have avoided this. They have avoided thinking about this in terms of what's going on with a village. How much food is necessary to feed a village? Where is the buffer? How's that buffer work in some capacity? We don't know. And it's a frustrating thing. Remember I mentioned networks. So here's the other part to it. We've had great conversations in terms of Neolithic villages and independent households and sort of the transition from different kinds of households based on labor needs, social networks, etc. And arguments that Ian Hodder and others have talked about in terms of sort of fierce egalitarianism amongst Neolithic villages in some form. All these conversations are scalar in some capacity, because depending on the number of people you think about there, the kind of pressures to form networks are very different, very, very different. And we haven't thought through that. We haven't thought through in terms of sort of networks of understanding. How do you get cooperative labor for harvest season? It's based on people you know, people you work with in the village in some form. We haven't really thought through those different pieces and how to sort of put that together. Food storage. We haven't really wrestled with that. We've wrestled with where people are storing food, how they're storing food in terms of technology in some form, but we don't really have a sense of how much are they storing in terms of storage planning. And storage planning is based on how many mouths do you need to feed each year. So basically, to have a conversation about storage and storage planning, you have to have an understanding of the expectation of what's going on in some form. Social inequality, that's another big one. And that is, in many pieces of research, social inequality is linked in some form either directly to population pressure, or that it's not necessarily in response to, but it's somewhat foundational to these arguments. Arguments by Brian Hayden and others are very at the forefront of these conversations. Brian has argued over the years that there were food surpluses and social inequality in the Neolithic, in the Natufian and the Neolithic. The question that I would raise quite simply is, how can you talk about a food surplus, which is essentially a term of carrying capacity, that you've got enough extra resources that you're going to be able to go down to the street corner and you're going to be able to sell it to somebody else or pass it on to somebody else for some form of social capital? How can you make arguments for a food surplus if you don't know how many people you need to feed? Researchers are just jumping over the whole question of that. We can look at other pieces of research, very good research by individuals that are here and thinking about these different pieces. When we think of sort of the material footprint of megasites or of these kinds of features, thinking about how much labor is necessary for building them. How is this labor controlled? What kind of people are there and sort of the extra resources to basically harvest food? Or the kind of work that's being done by some other really good scholars here, thinking in terms of demography and how do we model these things? And by the way, I'm not pointing this out as a critique in any form. This is very important research that is advancing things. And I applaud you for what you're taking on as a challenge in some form. I would just identify here the different pieces that are going into these formulas to think about these different pieces, the variables such as carrying capacity, farmer population, hunter-gatherer population. So people are starting to wrestle with this, but these are the exceptions. These are not the trend in any form. I want to sort of wrap up and come back to a fascinating example. This is Skara Brae, amazing Neolithic site in the Orkneys up in northern Scotland, excavated in 1928 to 1930 by V. Gordon Childe. And V. Gordon Childe, in his excavations there, basically went and did absolutely extraordinary. This is him, by the way. You can barely see him poking out. But this is a black and white photograph with some of his PhD people down in an excavation unit here, doing his excavations there. V. Gordon Childe, in his sort of reconstruction, when he started writing about population estimates with 20 plus large buildings, these buildings are the size of this room. There's 10 of them there now. There's at least 10 that probably were eroded away, given it's on an edge with the water. His estimate for the number of people, which is now absorbed by Scottish heritage and is being reflected, is 50 to 100 people. I have no problems with that. That makes good sense in some ways. It makes me wonder, however, if this was excavated today, if it was found, would this be identified as a mega site? Because They're big megastructures. There's a lot of them. It's totally different from all the residential sites around there. Would this be identified and empowered by all those words that we use to basically create specialness because it's identifiable? Scaling out very briefly, this is something that I think we're starting to see, this kind of conversation, this re-engagement with how we're developing our estimates. I think we're starting to see this in multiple different world areas. I don't know enough about Africa to comment on that. South America and Central America, there are some examples. Certainly in Western North America, there are examples of this re-engagement with population. Mississippian Cahokia is a good example of that. Neolithic Europe, I think we're starting to pull some of that apart as well. Neolithic China, the Near East. So these historic estimates that come from, I don't know, 30s through the 60s, there's now a sense that, wait, we need to rethink some of these and we need to re-engage with that and to try and understand where these numbers are coming from. So as I sort of wrap up, I want to sort of leave several points with you. One is this question about scale. I would argue that Neolithic communities, Çatalhöyük, for example, were much smaller than we think they are. Not 3,500 to 8,000 people, but something akin to 600 to 800 people. That's much smaller than we're thinking about in some form. And by the way, I'm not saying they're not important, and I'm not saying those Neolithic sites are not remarkable in some form, but I think the labor needs to make them and to sort of use them and how they existed as social and economic entities is different from the narratives we've been using. And we need to rethink some of that. We need to think about that critically. That takes us back to the argument that I started with of how comfortable is this new narrative with arguments for a Neolithic baby boom and early urbanism. I'm not comfortable with it at all. I think we're missing the point. Are there fascinating things that are going on in terms of what's drawing together people into a village, in the social relationships, the sort of the negotiation? Yes, fascinating, interesting conversations of sort of what's the glue that's bringing people in and the kind of labor that's involved. Fascinating conversation. Does that relate to early urbanism? I think that's forcing it at best. Here's the other part to it, and that is that we also now have different modeling and different conversations, essentially about a Malthusian crash. And the argument being that if you have villages, early Neolithic villages of 3,500 to 5,000 people or 8,000 people, and you don't have them after that, is that related to some form of crash? Be it the 8.2 KY problem, be it that of sustainability, resources, something similar. If your model is that you have 8,000 people and then you have a crash, well, that's very different than if you're dealing with 600 to 800 people. So the whole conversation about was there a crash may be in some ways just a figment of what we're doing at this point. Last one is this kind of question about a progressive improvement model, evolutionary model. And that is that I think what this is telling us is something more akin to not that the Neolithic was this revolutionary event, but it's a matter that it was a ratcheting of different circumstances. That doesn't mean it's not important. I have lived a lot of my life exploring the Neolithic in some form. I love it dearly. I've sworn my allegiance to it in different ways, in some form. But I think our modeling is such now that we need to rethink the Neolithic in terms of not as this massive baby boom with sort of the V. Gordon child empowerment of a revolution and a threshold, so much as an experiment in terms of human life at different points of time. So I was very long. You've been very patient with these kinds of conversations. I think you get a sense that hopefully you get a sense of sort of I've been trying to think through and explore some of these aspects. And hopefully some of that will provide an opportunity for you to think about some of the assumptions you've been working with and sort of think about demography a little bit better, because I do think there's an awful lot more we can do with it. And I think it will hopefully fundamentally provide us a much better sense of the archaeology that we deal with in different world areas. Thank you very much for your time.